Good evening. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education at the National First Ladies Library, located at the National First Ladies Historic Site in Canton, Ohio. I want to welcome everyone to our Cooking with the First Ladies program this evening. If you have questions for our speaker this evening, we recommend entering those questions into the chat or the Q&A. In order to get those to her, and we will have questions and answers at the end of this evening's talk. Before we get started, I also wanted to mention, if you're having trouble hearing the program and you're logged in through Eventbrite, one of the things I always recommend is clicking out of Eventbrite, and it will take you into Zoom, and it seems to be less clunky in Zoom. So I'm happy to troubleshoot with anyone in the chat, but it looks like my sound isn't muted. So again, I recommend that, and then checking your sound settings. Want to mention some upcoming programs, and I'll put in our Eventbrite those program links. This coming Thursday, October 28th at 6:30, we have a long-awaited program with Elaine Weiss, the journalist and historian, who will be speaking about her book, The Women's Hour, which follows the struggle to pass the 19th Amendment and focuses specifically on Tennessee. And we are excited to have we already have some really good questions coming through, so that's exciting. So we're really excited to have her here, and actually excited to have Sarah here tonight coming to us from Tennessee too. So really cool connection. So that's Thursday at 6:30. And she is also going to be speaking in the morning for students. So if you are connected to a homeschooler, an educator, a student, I recommend going to the Eventbrite and clicking on that link and passing it along to someone who may be an educator in your life. Those links will be available after the talk. So we aren't able to post them to our YouTube, but Elaine has offered to allow us to share with anyone who is registered afterwards. So please, if you cannot make it on Thursday, we recommend registering for those events. We have two really cool legacy lectures coming up as well. So on November 3rd, we are hosting the very cool Professor Amy Greenberg, who is going to be speaking about her book called Lady First, that is all about First Lady Sarah Polk. And I'm really enjoying it. It's a page turner. We are also going to be reading that title for our upcoming book club at the end of November. There is plenty of time to still read that book. And it is not a super dense read. It's really engaging. It's nonfiction, but it's really a wonderful book. And I highly recommend it. So we have that discussion group as well as our film discussion group in partnership with Stark Library. You can watch a film and then get on Zoom and discuss it with us. We're going to be doing In the Turn, which is a documentary about roller derby, and we're going to have a live roller derby person to take our questions on that day. So I'm really excited about it. And then we're going to be rolling into December and the holidays soon. And I'm really excited because we're going to have Colleen Christian Burke, who wrote a really amazing book about first ladies and the holidays. And she's going to be doing our legacy lecture in December, as well as a First Ladies Night craft along on Zoom. So I think those are going to be really fun. Those are all on Eventbrite, as well as all of our upcoming children's programs. We have our Fun with FLOTUS, which is going to be holiday based. We're going to look at holidays at the White House and Pardon That Turkey, our annual turkey pardoning events. And then we have our Ladies in the Lab. And next month we're doing Fanny Hess, who was actually a cook as well as a scientist. She worked in a lab with her husband, and she helped develop the gelatin that goes in the petri dish. So it should be really cool. I'm super excited about it. And we also have some really cool exhibitions up at the National First Ladies Historic Site. So if you are local, I recommend getting up here before those change in the next several months. So with that, I am going to introduce our speaker tonight. Sarah Morgan has a bachelor's degree in history, as well as a passion for the First Ladies. And upon discovering the book, The First Lady's Cookbook, Favorite Recipes of All of the Presidents of the United States at a thrift store back in 2019, she started an Instagram project called Cooking with the First Ladies. And we have been lucky enough to collaborate with her the past 2 years with some amazing programming. And tonight we are going to be doing Eleanor Roosevelt. And if you're familiar with Eleanor Roosevelt, you might think, wow, that is not someone I expected to spend a lot of time in the kitchen. But I have gotten to preview some of the recipes tonight, and they're really exciting and cool. So I am really excited to make my French 75 and sit back and watch. And I'm going to turn things over to Sarah. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, hey y'all, once again, I'm Sarah Morgan and welcome to Cooking with the First Ladies live program for the National First Ladies Library. And this evening, again, we're going to be talking about Eleanor Roosevelt, who was actually known by former President Harry Truman as the First Lady of the world due to her achievements in human rights. She was independently minded, politically engaged, and of course, the longest serving First Lady, not to mention one of the most respected. She also ties with Michelle Obama as the tallest of the First Ladies at 5 feet 11 inches in height. So most of this research that I've done came not only, of course, from the First Ladies Library information, but also the Ken Burns documentary, The Roosevelts, An Intimate History, which is very interesting if you're interested in the Roosevelts. And I also used a New York Times article known as The First Kitchen. Excuse me. This evening, I will be sharing a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt's 7.5-cent meals, including a surprise vitamin-rich lunch treat. And we will also be making Eleanor's famous scrambled eggs, which she made right at the table in a chafing dish almost every single Sunday night. It was like their Sunday tradition, as well as an angel food cake. But first, let's escape, as many Americans did in the 1930s, and begin with a cocktail. So although Eleanor abstained from alcohol, we will be making a popular 1930s cocktail called a French 75. This cocktail was featured in the classic movie Casablanca, and was also named actually after a French artillery gun. So to get started, you'll just need some gin, as well as some champagne, lemon juice, as well as a simple sugar syrup. So to make a simple sugar syrup, it's just 1 part sugar, 1 part water, and you just heat that up on the stove to make your syrup. So we're going to start with our gin. And we're going to do, it says it's in milliliters, I believe, on the recipe cards, but we can do tablespoons. So it's 3 tablespoons of gin. And then you're going to take 2 tablespoons of fresh squeezed lemon juice. Hopefully I have enough. And with your lemon, you're also going to want to do your lemon peel garnish if you're going to be doing that as well, to garnish on your glass, of course, before you squeeze your lemon. And then you're going to take 1 tablespoon of your simple syrup. Finally, you can either use a shaker or you can stir it, and you're just going to want to stir that up really good. And then if you don't have a shaker and you're like me, you have this situation, you're just going to want to strain it into a champagne flute. And finally, hopefully the champagne doesn't go everywhere, but then you're going to want to top that with a little bit of champagne. And then finally, like I said, you can do a little lemon twist garnish with your lemon. And there you have it, a French 75. So before I get started on the little PowerPoint presentation with some information that I have about Eleanor, Eleanor is actually vilified, saying publicly that young girls should be allowed to drink beer if prohibition were ever revoked. And that was even before she became First Lady. Eleanor was just no stranger to scrutiny. Some of the American public even disliked the fact that one of the sponsors of her radio commercials was a mattress company. So I'm not quite sure why that was such a big deal, but some people felt that it was. So with that, I'm going to step over my computer, share a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation with a little bit of history before we get started cooking. So Eleanor Roosevelt saw the first of 4 epic terms as First Lady when FDR was elected in 1933 during a decade that began with a new word, depression, and became known as the Dirty 30s. The era saw the fallout of the Wall Street crash and economic depression and unrest amongst major nations of the world. Other tragedies include the Hindenburg explosion, Kristallnacht, which was also the night of broken glass in 1938, and then the start of World War II a year later. In America as well, the Dust Bowl, which left the southern plains dry and barren due to the drought, heightened the devastating economic effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment was a major issue for many, but especially the country's youth. Eleanor worked with the American Youth Congress, which helped form the National Youth Administration to provide work as well as education for the younger generation, which led to these organizations allowing them the ability to assist with the war effort and stimulate the economy. Life in the 30s was, of course, much less glamorous than the previous decade. The prosperity of the 20s golden age was over, and many of their savings were gone, and the new poor emerged. FDR attempted to help both groups, but sadly, it said there were more suicides than paychecks. Soup kitchens became necessary and in high demand. In fact, Al Capone was one of the first to open a soup kitchen, and he served 3 meals a day there with no questions asked. The 1930s, as well as into the 40s, were also known as the golden age of Hollywood, which film stars such as Greta Garbo, Bela Lugosi, the Marx Brothers, and Shirley Temple, as well as blockbuster hits like King Kong and Gone with the Wind. It was also a time of classic novels, especially those by John Steinbeck, who became the representative author of the era, and Agatha Christie, one of the first true crime novelists. Just about everybody in the 1930s owned a radio, and then in 1938, Orson Welles terrified the nation with his radio broadcast of War of the Worlds. There were also projects completed in the 30s that are national landmarks today, such as the Empire State Building, the Golden Gate Bridge, and the Hoover Dam. Eleanor continued to be First Lady through another challenging and defining time in not only American history, but the world. Every aspect of life in America in the 1940s was affected by war, including not only pop culture, but the foods people ate and the clothes they wore. Much of the entertainment was based on propaganda, which included, in fact, a short film called Women in Defense, written by Eleanor Roosevelt herself. Among the popular celebrities of the decade included Jimmy Stewart, who starred in the classic movie It's a Wonderful Life, Rita Hayworth, and another iconic film starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, where our French 75 cocktail came from, Casablanca. Disney also released the amazing animated film Fantasia. Books published included Hemingway classics, but also The Diary of Anne Frank in 1947. The color television was created in 1940, and later, toys like the Slinky and Frisbee were introduced. Most of the 40s was all about swing, crooners, and jazz musicians, such as Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. Artie Shaw, one of jazz's finest clarinet players and leader of one of the most popular big bands of both the 30s and the 40s, made history by touring with Billie Holiday, which made him the first band leader to hire a Black female singer and to tour the South during segregation. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was born into a very wealthy family in New York on October 11th, 1884. Eleanor was the niece of former President Teddy Roosevelt and remains the only First Lady to have such a close blood relation to another president that isn't her husband. Her mother, Anna, who was described as strikingly beautiful, but also unconventionally robust for the time due to her tennis athleticism, was also known for being very vain and shallow. She was particularly harsh on Eleanor, giving her daughter the nickname Granny because her daughter did not meet her standards of beauty physically. These types of ladies today would be seen very differently. Eleanor would have been seen as vivacious and cheerful, as she very much was. Now, tragedy almost struck Eleanor for one of the first times in 1887 at the age of 2 while on board the SS Britannic alongside her family. The ship crashed into a White Star liner, and although they all made it out safely onto a lifeboat, this led to Eleanor being afraid of the ocean and boats for the rest of her life. Her father, who suffered from severe addiction to not only alcohol, but also narcotics, was eventually committed to an asylum in France by his family during an overseas trip. From 1890 to 1891, the Roosevelts lived in Italy, and Eleanor, due to her father's issues with alcoholism and her mother's depression, was placed in a convent in France. Sadly, these were just the beginning of Eleanor's troubled childhood, as her mother would die of diphtheria when she was 8 years old, and the next year her father passed, making her an orphan before her 10th birthday. Eleanor then went to live with her grandmother, who was an extremely intimidating woman and very strict out in the Hudson River Valley. Her education consisted of semi-private tutoring along with a few other students in the Roosevelt home because her aunts discovered that she could barely even read. She eventually learned many skills and was able to hold conversations and write in not only English, but also French, Italian, German, and Spanish. She eventually went to Allenswood Girls Academy in London, where Eleanor later says she encountered one of the greatest influences of her life, Marie, who was her teacher, and also learned an array of skills, which included not only art, but history and philosophy, and also accompanied her teacher on excursions to see those living in poverty and advocated for social responsibility and women's independence. During this time, the very athletic Eleanor was captain of the field hockey team, which she was extremely passionate about. Eleanor believes these were, quote, the happiest years of her life, and Marie really helped shape her later activism towards the working class. Allenswood was also where she finally encountered people who stressed substance and not appearance. Eleanor forever regretted not getting a college education. However, by the end of her life, she had 35 honorary degrees. FDR only received 31. Eleanor was always greatly influenced by activism and the philosophies of Teddy Roosevelt, which led her to join the progressive movement, a period of mass social activism, political reform, and trust busting, which exposed her to people who struggled with problems economically that were drastically different from her own, and taught her the power of politics and fixing issues with labor rights and the American lower class. Eleanor visited many workplaces and apartments to report back on their conditions, focusing especially on the workload, the pay, and the impact on the workers, especially women. She then helped form the Consumer White Label, which certified employers who adhered to appropriate and safe workplace conditions, standards and hiring ages and things like that, would be given different types of assistance. Even in her early years, it was very evident Eleanor was always concerned with the unfairness in the quality of life of others. During this time, she also worked as a volunteer for impoverished immigrant children in Manhattan. Although she went against the wishes of her family, who hoped she would become a debutante, she instead joined the Junior League, a group of women like herself who wanted to fix the horrific conditions some fellow Americans were living and working in, rather than focus solely on socialization. However, she did make her official social debut at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Eleanor met Franklin Delano Roosevelt on a train as she was on her way home, which became a riveting conversation between the two that led to a secret courtship and finally a marriage. The 20-year-old Eleanor married FDR in March of 1905 at an Upper East Side relative of Eleanor's home, where former president and her uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, also known as the Bull Moose, walked her down the aisle at the ceremony, even though he was actually supposed to be in NYC at a St. Patrick's Day parade. Although she respected Teddy, she was actually deeply intimidated by him just because of his outgoing personality. Eleanor was not only related to Teddy Roosevelt, but between herself and Franklin was related to a total of 11 presidents. Their marriage, however, was a relatively unhappy one, especially after her discovery of FDR's affair with Lucy Mercer, who happened to be Eleanor's personal secretary in 1918. Eleanor's mother in law, Sarah Roosevelt, who was initially opposed to the marriage, was a dominating presence during their first years of marriage, including ruling over their own home in New York. She was also heavily involved in not only their lives, but their children's as well. However, Sarah supported Eleanor after FDR's affair with Mercer, and in fact, then would go on to become the first presidential mother to vote for her son. However, this was an amazing turning point for Eleanor because she actually realized this was her time to find independence and lead a public life of her own. In fact, this continued into her days as First Lady as she refused Secret Service protection and drove her own car where she kept a gun in the glove compartment. The Roosevelts they did have one daughter and five sons. Her third child sadly passed at less than 1 year old, and they then passed the name Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. onto the third born son, who was ironically born in Canada and would go on to marry more times than any other child of a presidential couple, a whopping 5 times. If you can even imagine, the last of Eleanor's children only actually just passed away in August of 1991. After marriage, from 1910 to the 1920s, FDR started his political career and Eleanor took on several projects. In addition to raising a family, Eleanor volunteered for the American Red Cross and Navy hospitals during World War I and served food and coffee to those soldiers shipping out at Union Station. She also advocated for soldiers with mental illness because of the conditions in which she witnessed in hospitals and for the need for the government to intervene. When World War I ended, Eleanor used her linguistic services to become a volunteer translator in 1919 for the Congress of Working Women, and at this time, she was also touring battlefields. In 1920, she was active in the League of Women Voters, the Democratic Party, and even taught American history and literature at a local private school. It was during this time that Eleanor became even more introduced to politics when she became friends with Louis Howe during FDR's unsuccessful run in 1920, which led her to become very influential within the Democratic Party in New York State, which helped win additional support of women in the party for FDR. She also worked closely with the trade union for women, whose goals were to create a minimum wage, set hours for the work week, and stop child labor. During this time, she also became known as the Little Cabinet Wife during the Wilson administration. In 1921, Eleanor's life changed forever when FDR, at the age of 39, was diagnosed with polio and was paralyzed from the waist down. Eleanor not only took care of him and her children, but also began to join several causes that led her to be an influential and independent woman, which included, again, supporting the trade union and different women's divisions throughout New York. She co-founded Valkill Industries in 1927 by helping finance the construction of a factory that made traditionally crafted furniture, pewter, and cloth that capitalized on the popular colonial revival style, which was popular at that time. The business was not as successful as they anticipated, but it did later lead to more important initiatives related to New Deal policies. Valkill Cottage, which she used as a personal retreat, and according to the Eleanor Roosevelt National Historic Site webpage, felt this was, quote, the only place she could call her own. She felt that she could entertain whoever, stay up late reading, and have alone time. Eleanor once said, quote, Valkill is where I used to find myself and grow. At Valkill, I emerged as an individual. Eleanor continued to use Valkill Cottage throughout her life, which included hosting her 22 grandchildren, 13 great-grandchildren, and world leaders such as Winston Churchill. Today, you can visit the site in Hyde Park, and the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill is a nonprofit that works to not only exchange ideas, but also be, quote, a catalyst for change and the betterment of the human condition. She also continued to support her husband in his political efforts despite the continued affairs with not only Mercer, but Lady Missy LeHand. Eleanor was instrumental in shaping the public views of her husband. She appeared on his behalf and would even disagree with his politics on occasion to the media. He was later elected to governor of New York in 1928. Then 6 years later, they became the first family of the United States. The stock market crash had led to an unprecedented catastrophe that threatened to tear the nation apart. Hoover lost because FDR offered what America needed, a New Deal, and thus began the Roosevelt Revolution, whose campaign theme song was Happy Days Are Here Again. It's not only a cheerful tune, but it resonated with the nation because the people were looking to FDR for hope and his New Deal pledge for relief. Part of the New Deal was creating homestead communities, which were meant to relieve those struggling after the Great Depression and rebuild their lives. One such community was the Westmoreland Homestead, and after Eleanor visited, they were so impressed by her genuine compassion, they renamed the community Norvelt, taking syllables from her name, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor then went on to establish another similar community with the goal of helping impoverished people and assist them in becoming financially self-sufficient in Arthurdale, West Virginia. Even though she fervently campaigned for the project and put a lot of her own income into it as well, it was seen as a failure and the project was abandoned in 1941. Some of the residents, however, really didn't see it as a failure because it was so much better than their previous living conditions. FDR ultimately won 90% of the votes, the highest margin of any Democratic candidate in history. During the inauguration in March of 1933, FDR's speech electrified the nation, famously saying, quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And the Roosevelts skipped the inaugural ball that year, focusing on getting the New Deal rolling immediately. Eleanor, although she became one of the most influential first ladies in history, was slightly depressed and not too thrilled to assume the role. Eleanor had known all the previous first ladies that were, still living and saw the role as mostly focused on being a socialite and a housewife, which Eleanor changed when she ultimately brought unprecedented activism to the role. Her close friend, Lorena Hickok, referred to her as a reluctant first lady, which was also Hickok's biography she wrote about Eleanor, or the title. Lorena, who is nicknamed Hick, was an American journalist who was a devoted friend and mentor to Eleanor after becoming close while writing about her during FDR's first campaign. The nature of their relationship has always been debated. They wrote thousands of letters to one another, some of which people have viewed as romantic in nature. Lorena would go on to become part of the inner circle of the Roosevelt administration, which also included her living at the White House. And she also ultimately gave Eleanor her first official interview as First Lady. Eleanor became the 32nd First Lady for the first of 4 terms in 1933, and from the start used her position to advance many political causes, which were heightened due to her status as FDR's trusted advisor and ultimately became what some say was, quote, the most controversial First Lady in US history. From the beginning, she sought to redefine the role and was seen at the time as very outspoken, especially on civil rights issues. She changed the role through her active participation in American politics and used the position as a platform for her social activism. She was the first presidential spouse to hold regular press conferences, write a daily newspaper column, write a monthly magazine column, host a weekly radio show, speak at a national party convention, and the first presidential spouse to not only fly in a plane, but to travel abroad with her husband. Just 2 days after becoming First Lady, Eleanor held the first of 348 press conferences with almost 35 women in attendance. She helped women retain jobs during the Great Depression by giving them this exclusive access to press conferences at a time when women were typically barred from White House press conferences, and even eventually convinced FDR to give women more federal positions. Eleanor wrote a newspaper column, My Day, beginning in 1935 until 1962, which made the American readers feel that they knew her on a very personal level. She only ever missed 1 week of deadlines, which followed FDR's death in 1945. She talked and mused about topics including Prohibition, McCarthy, the Communist Hunt, Pearl Harbor, and among other things that just included her personal life. She averaged 6 articles per week, giving the public a real glimpse into her political views and an unprecedented glimpse into her personal life. She used the media more than any other first lady at that time and was just very outspoken. Roosevelt advertised a range of products, which I kind of mentioned earlier. One was mattresses, and another was hot dogs, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But in 1959, a TV appearance helped establish margarine as one of America's favorite spreads. The appearance netted her $35,000, which she used to purchase 6,000 care packages for poor families. By 1934, she set a record for the most times a first lady had spoken on radio at that time. Eleanor also not only made an immense contribution in the advancement of women's rights, but also advocated for racial equality, child welfare, and workers' rights, continuing that from her earlier years into being a first lady. She supported the war effort and visited troops during both World War I and World War II. After her experiences, during both of these wars, she especially saw the need to support refugees, as well as their rights and needs for education, as well as medical care and homes. In 1942, during a tour in Europe, Eleanor Roosevelt was encouraged by the positive results the Women's Land Army had on the agricultural outlook in England. She lobbied for a similar system to be put in place when she returned back to America, and in 1943, Congress passed the Emergency Farm Labor Program, creating basically the Women's Land Army of America, and it's estimated that 2.5 million women worked there during the war. She also worked with the Office of Civilian Defense, again visited troops, encouraged Americans to volunteer on the home front, and with other ventures advocated for women and African Americans to have more of a role in the war effort. During World War II, she also supported European refugee immigration to the United States. And although it was mostly unsuccessful in her efforts, she was able to get 83 Jewish people from the SS Kwanzaa political asylum in 1940. She was very outwardly supportive of the civil rights movement and was one of the few at the time in politics who advocated for equal rights for all people and all races. As a leading activist for African Americans, she broke with tradition on many occasions. One such time, she invited hundreds of African American children to the White House. Another instance was during the 1938 Southern Conference for Human Rights in Alabama. And when she arrived, she sat next to another African American associate, ignoring the segregated sections. When she was confronted, she instructed them to measure the distance between the two sections, and she then proceeded to sit directly in the middle. They also said that she was too frightening and they could not arrest her. She also spoke out against anti-Semitism and hatred in the United States, and in fact invited Marian Anderson to perform at the White House multiple times, including for the King and Queen of England, and went against the Daughters of the American Revolution when they refused to allow Marian to perform at the whites-only performers Constitution Hall at that time, and even went as far as to resign from the DAR organization. She also made money writing letters and lectures, and most of that, she gave all of that to charity. She also volunteered for the Salvation Army and the Red Cross. She was always very hands-on, and especially when the United States entered World War I, she served food to the soldiers and even helped do the finance books. She visited wounded soldiers, helped them get aid, and volunteered for organizations that would distribute knit sweaters, socks, and other necessities to the soldiers overseas. Another prime example of her care for others was when she met with the men of the Bonus Army, a protest group of World War I vets during their March on Washington in 1932. She visited their camp, listened to their concerns, and sang songs with them. It was all of this and more that earned her the nickname Lady Bountiful because of her generous nature. The media also referred to her as the busybody and the meddler because she really did act as the eyes and ears of FDR and was deeply involved in his presidency. Back to the hot dogs. Eleanor was also the First Lady to act as hostess to reigning British monarchs when King George and Queen Elizabeth visited Hyde Park, which the Roosevelts also used as the summer White House. The visit included an informal picnic, which has now famously featured hot dogs. After her time in the White House, Eleanor served as a delegate to the United Nations from 1945 until 1952 because she had witnessed firsthand the devastation World War I and World War II had had on Europe. In 1946, she wrote one of her columns on a trip to a displaced persons camp in Germany, and after meeting with Jewish survivors of the Holocaust said, quote, "When will our conscience grow so tender that we will act to prevent human misery rather than avenge it?" She believed that human rights started on the home front and hoped for global peace. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, felt that Eleanor's liberal views were dangerous and believed she was involved in communist activities. He had his agents monitor her, and this actually subsequently led to a really extensive file. Following FDR's death in 1945, Eleanor remained politically active and just continued to advocate for human rights and equality for the rest of her life. She became the first United States delegate to the United Nations and was on the UN Commission of Human Rights Board. However, her most prominent achievements of all was drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948 and serves as the foundation for international laws and treaties. Eleanor also chaired the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women during the Kennedy administration, and JFK even called her after the Bay of Pigs to assist with negotiating the release of Americans under Castro. She also continued to travel across the country and the world on speaking tours, where she also met with most of the world's leaders, continued her weekly columns, and made TV and radio appearances. In April 1960, Eleanor was diagnosed with anemia after being hit by a car a few days earlier. 2 years later, she began steroid treatments, which caused her to develop a rare form of tuberculosis in her bone marrow, which some have attributed to her contraction to visits to those with poor living conditions and lack of access to health care. Eleanor did not want to die in a hospital, so against medical advice, she returned home that October and was taken care of by her daughter, Anna, who Anna had actually stood in as First Lady when her mother was busy with other political activities, and Anna had actually become a successful author. Sadly, a few weeks later, on November 4th, she appeared to have suffered a heart attack or a stroke, and then died, especially of cardiac failure, in her own bed at home on the Upper East Side on November 7th, 1962, at the age of 78. She was referred to as, quote, "the object of almost universal respect" in her obituary, and continues to be one of the most respected women in American history. By the end of her life, she had published more than 8,000 columns, close to 600 articles, 27 books, and thousands of letters, and had made over 1,000 speeches, and had appeared on close to 300 radio and television shows. The FDR Presidential Library and Museum, which opened in 1946, set a precedent for future presidential libraries. The FDR Memorial in DC also includes a bronze statue of Eleanor, the only presidential memorial to depict a First Lady. On November 8th, all flags were ordered half-mast for her by JFK. Attendants of her funeral included Kennedy, LBJ, Truman, and Eisenhower. Adlai Stevenson said, quote, "What other single human being has touched and transformed the existence of so many? She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world." Now, after her death, her portrait was commissioned in 1949 and was presented and purchased at a White House reception by the White House Historical Commission and was attended by Lady Bird Johnson, and it still hangs in the Vermeil Room today. Eleanor was also inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1973 and was awarded one of the first human rights prizes in 1968 by the United Nations. Her son has also expressed, quote, "Her deepest regret at the end of her life was that she had not forced FDR to accept more refugees from Nazism during the war." Okay, so a little bit about cooking before we actually get started with a few of our recipes. Eleanor's 7.5-cent meals. So of course, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was thrust into World War II, and Overnight, things changed for families across the country when food began to be rationed. By May of 1942, prices were frozen on almost all everyday goods, mostly starting with sugar and coffee. The fall of that year brought vouchers, and by the spring of 1943, meat, cheese, fats, fish, all sorts of canned things and processed foods were added to the list of ration products. Every American, including children, were entitled to a series of ration stamps they could use to buy restricted items, along with additional payments in order to discourage like hoarding and just be sure everyone got an equal distribution of these kind of scarce resources at that time. Sugar was the first and one of the longest items rationed and didn't end until 1947. Most other food rationing ended in 1945. Several wartime cookbooks were distributed amongst households in order to provide creative solutions and ingredient substitutions during rationing. For the most part, the ingredients provided were simple and encouraged homemakers they could create healthy and tasty foods on limited supplies. They also kind of commented on nutrition. Some described vegetable gelatin molds, such as the tomato jelly I will be presenting to you this evening, as vitamin rich lunch treats. The cookbooks tried to be very lighthearted and just really encourage positivity under the circumstances with the food shortages. With the country, also prior to that, had suffered through the Great Depression and then the shortages of war, Eleanor insisted this whole time on running the White House with the same economy that her fellow Americans faced. She said, quote, "It's not fair to ask of others what you are unwilling to do yourself." Now, the Roosevelts adhered to mandatory rationing along with other voluntary wartime home front initiatives, including planting a victory garden, and they installed blackout curtains at the White House. Food in the Roosevelt White House was famously poor. Eleanor, her longtime friend, and White House cook Henrietta Nesbitt, and alongside Cornell University, created these 7.5 cent meals, which included deviled eggs, mashed potatoes with a side of tomato sauce, wheat bread, and coffee. They felt that this provided protein that was cheap and had a lot of nutritional values, costing less than 10 cents per person. Another was spaghetti with boiled carrots. One pot for the whole meal, they said. The Roosevelts often served noodles with any type of meat or vegetable leftovers, as well as bread and butter sandwiches and creative sides. Eleanor Roosevelt admitted many unappetizing meals were served during her time at the White House, but was done on purpose in order to be patriotic and was known as conscious cookery. She stated that during the war, we lived up to rationing strictly. She required all food in the White House to be served on the availability of rations and the recipes recommended to American housewives. Henrietta tried not to skimp too much on food, as FDR was a 1940s foodie and did not want him to worry about it, but had ideas to stretch, especially the meat supply at the White House. Some of the examples of food served at the White House during the Roosevelt administration was creamed fish, milk corno, which was a mix of skim powdered milk, cornmeal, and salt, as well as prune pudding and broiled kidneys on toast. Now, two things, of course, like I said, that were strongly encouraged during the 1940s were not only canning, but also victory gardens. People were urged to plant these gardens to offset food rations and add vitamins and support the war. But it's estimated that by 1943, up to 20 million victory gardens were planted. It was also estimated that 4 billion cans and jars of food were produced in that same year. Now, one slogan was grow more, can more in 44. No matter the meals served during this time, which included also baked onions stuffed with peanut butter, which if you go to my Instagram page after, if you're interested, you can see that I did try baked onion and peanut butter, very interesting, and corned beef salad. And family diets just basically changed across the country forever because of this emphasis on thrifting and using your ingredients wisely. But they also had the ability to have leftovers because the refrigerator was had been invented years earlier, but was widely distributed. So Eleanor was infamous for having one, if not the worst, kitchens at the White House. She honestly joined in solidarity with the American people, not only through rations during war, but also in economic depression. both of which devastated and uprooted far more than our country's lives. Although FDR and distinguished guests disliked the meals, Eleanor stood her ground, and especially Ernest Hemingway, after dining at the White House in the 30s, said, "We had rainwater soup, rubber squab, a wilted salad, and some cake that an admirer had sent in." He was like a lot of visitors to the White House who would frequent eating before they would attend. By the way, squab is pigeon, so FDR especially enjoyed coffee. He enjoyed a cup of dark French roast in the morning with breakfast, but according to Eleanor, eventually gave up coffee and turned to milk because he just liked it better. Also, during their time in the White House, coffee was added to the ration list in 1942, so they were limited to a cup per day. But even though FDR stopped drinking coffee, he did have a secret trick, which was, quote, "If you dry out your used coffee grounds, add a teaspoonful of fresh coffee, then you boil it up." So that was his secret. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll start cooking. Okay, awesome. So the first thing we're going to make this evening, I also have an actual ration book that belongs in our family, as well as my Mama's wartime cookbook. So two actual examples. I also have Eleanor Roosevelt's My Day. You can buy the book, and it's a collection of all of her articles. But first, we're going to make our angel food cake with pink clouds. So what you're going to need is a cup of cake flour, 1¼ cups egg whites, 1½ teaspoons cream of tartar, 1½ cups of sugar, 1 teaspoon almond flavoring, and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And that's for our cake mixture. So what we're going to do first, well, you'll set your oven to 375 degrees to preheat. And then you'll sift your flour, which I've already done. And then what we're going to do first is we're going to beat our egg whites until they get really foamy. And while we do that, another interesting Eleanor story. Prior to the 1937 disappearance of Amelia Earhart, she had a unique encounter with Eleanor Roosevelt in 1933. So while at a White House event, Amelia suggested the ladies leave the party and take a quick excursion in a plane. Earhart and Eleanor, both still dressed to the nines, took turns flying the plane to Baltimore and back. Eleanor later said, quote, "It does not mark an epoch, does it, when a girl in an evening dress and slippers can pilot a plane at night?" Now, Amelia inspired Eleanor to get her pilot's license. And after her disappearance, the Roosevelts organized a 250,000-mile, basically $4 million search effort. Eleanor told reporters that she was basically sure that Amelia's last words were, "I have no regret." This also made Eleanor the first lady to fly in a plane. Okay, so our egg whites are really foamy. So after we do that, we're going to add our cream of tartar. And 1 cup of the sugar. So just about half. And then we are also going to add our salt. All right, let's mix this up. And we want to be sure that they're going to kind of stand up in kind of like little egg peaks, almost like you're making a meringue. Okay. So now we are just going to add in sugar, rest of our sugar. our almond flavoring, almond extracts. And then we're going to be slowly mixing in our flour. All right, our batter's looking pretty good. Just get a little bit of this down off the sides. I also have no culinary really background. I just enjoy cooking, and it was a fun way to cook my way through the First Ladies and learn more about them all at the same time. Okay. So that looks good. And then, of course, with an angel food cake, you'll just want to use one of these pans. So we're just going to pour that in. Now, if you want it to be full, you can double the recipe that's on your recipe card to make a bigger cake. And then what you would do is you're just going to bake this on 375 for about 30 minutes. Okay, then our next step is the pink clouds, which I think are so cool, so cute. All right. You know it's serious when you got two mixers. So we're going to do our heavy cream and our sugar. You can also use powdered sugar. I'm actually using powdered sugar. And then we're just going to mix that up really good until it makes a really good whipped cream. So while we're doing that, I do have one other very interesting story, which involves Hillary Clinton. And in 1996, according to the Washington Post, was having imaginary conversations with Eleanor. And some say she was actually holding seances with the former First Lady with the help of popular New Age mysticism and author and doctor Jean Houston. And although a lot of those reports have been denied, an entire chapter of Hillary's book is titled Conversations with Eleanor, and said that imaginary conversations were mentally useful in order to help, with problems, but that she needed to choose the right person. And in this case, Hillary believed Eleanor Roosevelt to be perfect for her. So sometimes it takes a good minute. Okay. So once you've done that, and this is for your pink clouds frosting, you'll have your frosting. And then what you want to do is just take your strawberries that you kind of like cut in half or cut in fourths, and of course cut the tops off, and just kind of mix them in really easily with your kind of icing stuff here. And then, once you have your cake baked, then you're just going to top it, and I will show you the finished product. So it is your angel food cake, Eleanor Roosevelt's style, with your pink cloud frosting, which if you also would like to, you can dye your frosting with a little bit of pink just to make it extra pink clouds. So there you have it, Eleanor Roosevelt's angel food cake. So next we're going to make, and it seems so funny and so simple, and but Eleanor Roosevelt was very much known for her scrambled eggs. The Roosevelt family ate those scrambled eggs just about every single Sunday night. So what you're going to do is you'll take 6 eggs, and she cooked hers in a chafing dish right at the dinner table. I don't have one of those, so I'm just going to have to do it like this. But then she also had a little bit of heavy cream. And then she just said a dash of salt and a dash of pepper. And then they say that she actually mixed hers up with a fork. And they said that you wanted to really mix it up really well. And again, just with our time constraints, I won't be able to cook these eggs for you, but I do have the finished product. And then you'll put a tablespoon of butter in your skillet. I always recommend a cast iron skillet. They just always make things taste better. And so very simple recipe for scrambled eggs. And what you'll get is this very nice, very fluffy Eleanor Roosevelt scrambled eggs. So this Sunday night, y'all can make scrambled eggs and celebrate your Sunday like the Roosevelts. Now our last thing, and I'm just really going to be talking about it because again, would be very difficult to show, but it is that tomato jelly. So it's really simple. You just take your tomatoes, sugar, whole cloves, as well as half a lemon and liquid pectin. Now I will tell you that I had to use a little extra pectin, but this is tomato jelly. And this was, again, known as a vitamin-rich lunch treat. I also used tomatoes from my own garden for this. So I kind of really felt like it was a victory garden situation. If you're interested, you can totally try to make the tomato jelly. It's really easy. You basically just put all of those items together in a big pot, make sure and continuously stir it so that it doesn't burn on the bottom, which is really easy to do. And then you have yourself a nice, very simple, low ingredient tomato jelly. So with that, I just want to end that with Eleanor, who really devoted herself to humanitarian causes with really fierce tenacity, but also grace, committed herself to not only social reform, but again, really forever changed the role of First Lady. And in her 78 years, ultimately really became one of the most admired people, not only in our country, but the world. Finally, a quote that I love that I came across from her, which really resonates not only today, but should be remembered for forever is, quote, "The future is literally in our hands to mold as we like, but we cannot wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow is now." So not only is Eleanor ranked as one of the top 2 First Ladies along with Abigail Adams, but there is even an Eleanor Barbie now as part of the Inspiring Women collection. And in addition, there's the Eleanor Roosevelt Paper Project, which works to continue to spread her words in order to educate and inspire. So with that, thanks y'all so much for coming here tonight and tuning into the live program. And I always try to get a little slang from the time period that I'm talking about with these live programs. So I hope y'all enjoyed it. And as they said in the 40s, didn't think it was gobbledygook. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Allison if there's any questions.
Sarah, that was wonderful. I'm always so impressed with your PowerPoint abilities that I'm really excited to sit down with you and get details of how you put those together. So, one of the questions from the audience at the beginning related to how you choose which First Lady to present.
Oh, that's really great. And actually, I was talking already about, who's the ones I'm going to choose maybe for next year. It's really hard. And I'm going to tell you, there's this utter relief right now of, I can't believe I chose Eleanor Roosevelt. She's amazing. And I am in awe of her, really, honestly. But there's just so much information, I mean, out there about her is just more than any of the First Ladies. And of course, I cooked for her before, but I hadn't really gone into it quite as much. I really, I chose Grace Coolidge because the 1920s are one of my favorite time periods. So that was one reason I went towards her. But I think she's probably my favorite First Lady now. I went for Rosalind Carter because of the CNN documentary that came out last year about Jimmy Carter and the rock and roll, 70s and stuff. And I just thought that was cool. So I guess I kind of just try to gravitate towards what I find interesting at the time or whatnot. But I did do Jackie Kennedy this past summer. And of course, she's always been of interest. So I don't know. It's hard to choose. It really is. But that's wasn't probably a really good answer, but
No, it was great. It's hard to track some of these recipes and things down. So it's always fun to like make a connection, like Ida McKinley's pumpkin pie, which was passed on to us by someone who had it shared with them. There's a few other questions in the audience and some comments. So someone shared a link to the Barbie doll, and I know just from being familiar with some of the regular participants in the chat that there are people here who own the Barbie dolls who shared them with their grandchildren. So that is really cool, and I want to thank people for that. I found the book about First Ladies cooking online, and I'm going to make some of those recipes. Yeah. And are there you started with the one recipe book, but are there other recipe books that you look to as resources?
I do. I guess I do a lot online. I do have a couple other cookbooks. That's my only of that First Lady's cookbook that I only have the one copy, but I know there's different editions of it. The one that I found ended at Reagan, which of course I just went ahead and kept going. But I know that there's other ones because I actually have people that will be at an antique store or something and send me a look what I see here, and stuff. So there's definitely more out there. And I mean, there's even specifics to First Ladies. I know that I've just come across one. It's like there's one that's about Eleanor Roosevelt and kind of like that time period recipes. So there's definitely stuff like that out there that you can find. And you had just been telling me about the Julie Nixon's cookbook.
Yeah, so I've taken a special interest in cookbooks for children, and I was super excited about the Waffles and Mochi program on Netflix that Michelle Obama has produced, which has a holiday special coming up. And then I knew that Julie Nixon had done some cross stitch projects, but I was surprised to find on eBay that she did a children's cookbook too. So I've been collecting slowly but carefully, not cooking them yet because I'm barely cooking chicken nuggets at this point. But I even have a ladybird chili recipe on my refrigerator right now. So there's plenty out there, I think, to explore that we can continue
Oh
digging
yeah.
in here. Um, so this has been wonderful. And lots of people in the chat are just sharing resources and information that they have. Was there anything that surprised you in putting together this presentation about Eleanor that you did not know about her?
Yes. Oh, I guess I knew, I guess more of the kind of the affairs with, and I knew about it. I'd heard about it, but I didn't know, uh, you know, a ton about it. I didn't know how extensive it was. I didn't know about their living situation, the White House, which I didn't go into that part of their life so much, just because it's more just about her and it's positive, but I just didn't really realize, and that she was really, I mean, just let's do this, and let's stick together. So I guess just that aspect of her kind of surprised me. I also uh, didn't really realize how she had passed away, and that she was still, even to that day, like going to these places where it was probably dangerous for you know you to go, or health related things. And so I found that interesting. But um and also, just on top of that, just reviewing for myself how much she actually did as First
Mhm.
Lady, I guess.
It's
So
fascinating. Well, Sarah, as always, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge of First Ladies and your cooking and recipes. This has been really great, and I wish I was there to help sample the food and help you wash the dishes this evening.
I'm
So
very lucky. My husband does help me with that. So
with that, myself, representing the National First Ladies Library here, and my son are going to wish you all a good night. And thank you so much for joining us. And this presentation will be posted on the National First Ladies YouTube page tomorrow, and we will get recipes out to everyone who doesn't have them yet. So if you cook something, please send us a picture, share it with us on social media, and we look forward to cooking with you all soon. Thank you, Sarah.
thanks. Thanks y'all so much.
Bye.